Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Marlowe stood at the altar in a dress that wasn't hers, marrying a man she'd never spoken to, while 300 strangers watched her cry. The lace scratched her collarbone. Her father's hand gripped her elbow so tight she could feel the bruises forming beneath the silk sleeves. Reverend Pike's voice droned through words she couldn't hear over the rushing in her ears. Across from her stood Cade Thornwell, 32 years old, expressionless as granite, his jaw set like he was signing a business contract instead of taking a terrified girl as his wife. His suit probably cost more than her father's entire ranch. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked through her, past her, at something in the distance only he could see. The church smelled like lilies and whiskey and her mother's absence. Mama had been dead 2 years now, buried under the cottonwood tree on the edge of their failing property, and Marlowe knew she'd be ashamed of this moment. Ashamed of Papa for selling his daughter like livestock to pay his debts. The town of Copperstone had gathered not to celebrate but to witness, their faces a mix of pity and fascination. Mrs. Brennan whispered behind her fan. The Sutler boys snickered in the back pew. Marlowe's younger sister Iris sat in the front row, tears streaming down her 12-year-old face, her small hands twisted in her lap. This was supposed to be a fairy tale. This was supposed to be the day a girl became a woman surrounded by love. Instead, Marlowe felt like she was being buried alive. When Cade slipped the ring onto her finger, it was cold and too loose, spinning around her knuckle like it didn't want to stay. His hand was calloused and huge, swallowing hers completely. She wondered if he'd ever held anything gently in his life. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Cade didn't kiss her. He just nodded once, released her hand, and turned toward the crowd like the matter was settled. Papa exhaled with relief so loud half the church heard it. The organ started playing. People stood. Marlowe's legs wouldn't move. She stood frozen at the altar, her vision blurring, her breath coming in short gasps that made her corset feel like iron bands around her ribs. Then Cade turned back. For the first time, he looked directly at her, and his eyes were the color of a storm rolling over the plains, gray and endless and unreadable. He offered his arm without a word. She took it because she had no choice. They walked down the aisle together, and the crowd parted like she was contagious. Outside, the June sun blazed mercilessly. A line of black carriages waited, polished and gleaming, horses stamping in the heat. Cade's men stood at attention, all dressed in matching black, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. It looked like a funeral procession. Marlowe's stomach turned. She wanted to run, to grab Iris and disappear into the hills, but Papa was already shaking Cade's hand, already counting money in his mind, already free of the burden she'd become. Cade handed her into the lead carriage without ceremony. The interior was crimson velvet, oppressively hot, smelling of leather and cigars. He climbed in beside her, and the door shut with a final click. The driver snapped the reins. As they pulled away from the church, Marlowe looked back one last time. Iris stood on the steps, her face crumpling, and Marlowe pressed her palm against the window glass. The town disappeared behind clouds of dust. Cade sat across from her in silence, his face unreadable, his hands folded on his knees. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough like stones grinding together. "There's something you need to see when we get home." Marlowe's heart hammered. She didn't have a home anymore. She had a prison with a ring on her finger. The carriage rolled on toward Thornwell Estate, toward whatever fate awaited her, and she realized with cold certainty that her life as Marlowe Brennan had ended the moment she said "I do." 6 months earlier, Marlowe had been someone different. She woke before dawn every morning to milk the 3 cows Papa hadn't sold yet, her hands red and cracked from the cold. The Brennan Ranch sat on the eastern edge of Copperstone, 70 acres of dust and stubborn grass that refused to grow thick enough to feed cattle properly. Mama's death had cracked something in Papa's spirit, and he'd spent the 2 years since then drinking away their savings and refusing to see that the land was dying. Marlowe did the work of 3 ranch hands, mending fences, hauling water from the creek, keeping Iris fed and schooled and out of Papa's way when he was in one of his dark moods. She was 17 but felt 40, her youth leaking away with every sunrise that brought more problems than solutions. Iris was the only light left. Sweet Iris with her blonde braids and her collection of smooth river stones and her endless questions about whether Mama was happy in heaven. Marlowe would sit with her on the porch after chores, both of them too tired to do anything but watch the sky turn purple, and Iris would lean against her shoulder and say, "When I grow up, I'm gonna be rich and buy us a new ranch and Papa won't be sad anymore." Marlowe never had the heart to tell her that being rich wasn't something people like them could just decide to be. Money was a door that only opened for certain folks, and the Brennans had been on the wrong side of it for generations. Still, she let Iris dream because dreams were free and the girl had so few pleasures left. The trouble started when Papa borrowed money from Silas Crenshaw, the snake who owned the bank and half the businesses in Copperstone. Crenshaw was the kind of man who smiled while he squeezed, who'd foreclose on a widow's home and sleep soundly that same night. Papa had needed the loan to buy seed and pay the property taxes, promising he'd have it back by harvest. But harvest came and went with barely enough crop to feed themselves, let alone sell. The debt sat there like a stone around Papa's neck, growing heavier with interest every month. Marlowe watched him shrink under the weight of it, watched him start drinking before noon, watched him stop looking her in the eye. She knew something terrible was coming. She could feel it in the air like the pressure before a lightning strike. Then one evening in December, Papa came home with Silas Crenshaw and another man Marlowe had never seen before. The stranger was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in clothes that cost more than their entire year's income, his face weathered but handsome in a hard-edged way. He stood in their tiny kitchen like a wolf in a henhouse, too big for the space, his presence sucking all the air out of the room. Papa introduced him as Cade Thornwell, owner of the largest cattle operation in 3 territories, a man whose wealth was legendary and whose reputation was ice-cold. Marlowe served them coffee with shaking hands while they talked in low voices. She caught fragments: debt forgiveness, arrangement, practical solution, beneficial for everyone. Her stomach twisted with dread. After the men left, Papa couldn't meet her eyes. He poured himself whiskey and sat at the table with his head in his hands. Marlowe stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, knowing without being told that her life had just been bargained away. "Papa," she whispered. He looked up, his face gray with shame and relief mixed together. "You're gonna marry Cade Thornwell come June," he said, his voice hollow. "He's agreed to clear all our debts and set us up proper. You'll want for nothing, Marlowe. You'll live like a queen." She couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The room tilted sideways. "You sold me," she finally choked out. Papa slammed his hand on the table. "I saved us. I saved this family. You think I had a choice? You think I wanted this?" But his eyes told a different story. He'd wanted it. He'd wanted the easy way out, and she was the price. Marlowe turned and walked out into the freezing night, and she didn't stop walking until she reached the creek where Mama was buried, and there she fell to her knees and wept until she had nothing left inside. The months between December and June stretched like years. Marlowe moved through her days like a ghost, doing her chores mechanically, speaking only when necessary, avoiding Papa's guilty glances and Iris's confused questions. The town found out within a week. News like that spread faster than wildfire in a place as small as Copperstone. Suddenly Marlowe became an object of fascination and pity. Women whispered when she walked by. Men tipped their hats with awkward sympathy. The younger girls looked at her with a mixture of envy and horror, unable to decide if she was lucky or doomed. Cade Thornwell was a name everyone knew but few had met. He lived 15 miles north on an estate that sprawled across the valley, employed over 100 men, and kept to himself with an intensity that bred rumors. Some said he was cruel. Others said he was just lonely. All agreed he was powerful enough that crossing him would be suicide. Marlowe saw him only once more before the wedding. He rode into town on a black stallion in February, and the whole street seemed to pause and watch. He went straight to the general store, bought supplies without small talk, and rode out again without acknowledging anyone's existence. Marlowe had been buying flour when he walked in, and she'd frozen like a rabbit spotting a hawk. He'd glanced at her for maybe 3 seconds, just long enough for her to see that his eyes held no warmth, no curiosity, no interest in who she was as a person. She was a transaction to him, a solution to some problem she didn't understand. When he left, Mrs. Patterson had gripped Marlowe's arm and whispered, "That man's been alone too long, honey. Don't know if that makes him safe or dangerous." Marlowe didn't know either, and the not knowing was its own special torture. Iris took the news hardest of all. When Marlowe finally told her, the girl's face had crumpled like paper. "But you're my sister," Iris sobbed. "You can't leave me here with Papa. Who's gonna braid my hair? Who's gonna help me with my letters?" Marlowe held her tight and lied through her teeth. "I'll visit all the time. And you'll come stay with me. It won't be like I'm gone." But they both knew it was a lie. Married women belonged to their husbands, went where their husbands went, did what their husbands allowed. Marlowe would be trapped in whatever life Cade Thornwell decided to give her, and there was no guarantee that life would include room for a little sister with river stones in her pockets and questions about heaven. Spring came with brutal irony, everything blooming and alive while Marlowe felt herself dying inside. Papa tried to make peace with her a dozen times, but she couldn't forgive him. He'd chosen his own comfort over her freedom, and no amount of justification could erase that betrayal. She stopped speaking to him entirely by April. Iris became the messenger, carrying requests and information between them like a tiny diplomat trying to hold a family together. Meanwhile, packages started arriving from Thornwell Estate: fabric for her wedding dress, jewelry she'd never wear again, books on household management like she was being trained for a job rather than a marriage. Each delivery felt like another nail in the coffin of her old life. The night before the wedding, Marlowe couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in her small bedroom, watching the stars wheel overhead, and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Would Cade be cruel? Would he expect things from her she didn't know how to give? Would she disappear into that big house and slowly forget who Marlowe Brennan had been? Her hands trembled as she braided her hair, the same way Mama had taught her when she was small. She thought about running, just taking Iris and disappearing into the night. But where would they go? How would they survive? Papa had made sure she understood that refusing meant losing the ranch, losing everything, condemning them all to destitution or worse. So she sat in the dark and waited for dawn, and when the sun finally rose on her wedding day, she put on the white dress that had arrived in a box lined with tissue paper, and she walked toward her fate with her head high and her heart breaking, because that was all she had left, her dignity, and the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, this nightmare might have an ending she couldn't yet see. The carriage ride to Thornwell Estate took 2 hours, winding through hills that gradually transformed from dry scrubland to lush grazing pastures dotted with more cattle than Marlowe had ever seen in her life. The herds stretched to the horizon, hundreds of animals marked with the Thornwell brand, a capital T wrapped in thorns. Cade sat across from her in silence the entire journey, his gaze fixed out the window, his jaw working like he was chewing over thoughts he'd never share. Marlowe studied him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. His face was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin, a scar cutting through his left eyebrow that made him look even more severe. His hands were huge and scarred across the knuckles. These were working hands despite his wealth, hands that had built something rather than simply inherited it. When the estate finally came into view, Marlowe's breath caught despite herself. She'd expected something grand, but this was beyond imagination. The main house rose 3 stories high, built from honey-colored stone that glowed in the afternoon sun, with wide verandas wrapped around each level and massive windows that reflected the sky. Gardens sprawled in every direction, roses and lavender and plants she couldn't name, all tended to perfection. Beyond the main house sat barns bigger than most homes, stables, bunkhouses for the ranch hands, a smithy with smoke rising from its chimney, even a small chapel. This wasn't just a ranch. This was a kingdom, and she'd just become its unwilling queen. The carriage stopped at the front entrance where a line of household staff stood at attention. Cade climbed out first and turned to help her down, his hand steady under her elbow. A woman in her 50s stepped forward, her gray hair pinned in a severe bun, her face kind despite its sternness. "Mrs. Thornwell, she said, and Marlowe flinched at the name. I'm Mrs. Hewitt, the head of household. We've prepared the East Wing for you. Anything you need, you just ask. Her voice was warm, motherly almost, and it made Marlowe want to cry because she missed her own mother so desperately in that moment. Cade gave brief instructions about dinner being served at 7, then disappeared into the house without another word to Marlowe, leaving her standing there with Mrs. Hewitt and the assembled staff, feeling like an imposter in borrowed clothes. Mrs. Hewitt led her inside through hallways that seemed to go on forever, past rooms filled with furniture more expensive than anything Marlowe had ever touched, up a grand staircase with a banister carved from dark wood, down another hallway lined with paintings of stern-faced people she assumed were Thornwell ancestors. Finally they reached a suite of rooms that took Marlowe's breath away. The bedroom alone was bigger than her entire house back in Copperstone. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, covered in quilts that looked hand-stitched and probably priceless. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the valley. A writing desk sat by the window. A wardrobe took up an entire wall. Your things will be brought up shortly, Mrs. Hewitt said, though I suspect you'll be needing a new wardrobe entirely. Mr. Thornwell has accounts established in town. She paused, her eyes softening. I know this is difficult, dear, but you're safe here. Whatever you may have heard about Mr. Thornwell, he's a fair man. Hard, yes, but fair. Marlowe wanted to ask what fair meant when you'd been bought like property, but she bit her tongue. Mrs. Hewitt showed her the adjoining bathroom with its enormous clawfoot tub and indoor plumbing, luxury Marlowe had only heard about, and then a sitting room with shelves of books and comfortable chairs positioned to catch the afternoon light. This is all yours, Mrs. Hewitt said. Your private space. Mr. Thornwell's rooms are in the West Wing. The implication was clear: separate bedrooms, separate lives, a marriage in name only. Relief and confusion washed over Marlowe in equal measure. Was this better or worse than what she'd feared? Finally alone, she walked out onto the balcony and gripped the railing, looking out over the vast estate that was now somehow hers too. The sun was beginning its descent, painting everything gold and purple. In the distance, she could see ranch hands moving cattle, could hear the faint sounds of hammering from the smithy, could smell hay and horses and the particular scent of a working ranch. It was beautiful. It was prison. It was her life now, and she had no idea what it meant or what Cade Thornwell wanted from her or what he'd meant when he said there was something she needed to see. That thought made her stomach clench with anxiety. What could possibly silence a whole town? What wedding gift could matter when the marriage itself was a transaction? She stood on that balcony as the sun set on her wedding day, and she'd never felt more alone in her entire life. Dinner was an awkward affair in a dining room that could seat 30 but held only 2. Marlowe sat at one end of the long mahogany table while Cade sat at the other, an impossible distance between them that somehow felt appropriate. The food was excellent: roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, but Marlowe could barely eat. She was too aware of the silence, too conscious of Cade watching her with that unreadable expression, too anxious about whatever he'd promised to show her. The house staff moved like ghosts, serving courses and refilling glasses without making a sound. Finally, when the plates were cleared and coffee served, Cade stood. "Come with me," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Marlowe's hands shook as she set down her napkin and followed him out of the dining room. He led her through the house to a wing she hadn't seen yet, down a hallway that grew quieter with each step, until they stopped at a heavy wooden door. Cade pulled a key from his pocket, and something in his face shifted, a crack in that granite exterior that might have been grief or might have been something else entirely. He unlocked the door but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he turned to Marlowe, and for the first time since they'd met, he really looked at her. "I need you to understand something before you see this," he said. "I didn't choose this marriage because I wanted a wife. I chose it because I needed someone I could trust, someone who had as much to lose as I do, someone who wouldn't be here for my money because you'd already been paid for." The words stung, but they were honest. Marlowe appreciated the honesty even as it hurt. "I don't understand," she whispered. Cade opened the door. The room beyond was a nursery, pale yellow walls, a crib carved from cherry wood, toys stacked neatly on shelves, a rocking chair by the window. But what made Marlowe's breath catch was the child asleep in the crib. A little girl, maybe 2 years old, with dark curls and olive skin and the most peaceful expression on her sleeping face. "Her name is Evangeline," Cade said quietly, stepping into the room with a gentleness Marlowe hadn't known he possessed. "She's my daughter. Her mother was Maria Sanchez, a woman I loved more than my own life. She died bringing Evangeline into the world." His voice cracked on the words, and Marlowe saw the grief he'd been carrying like stones in his pockets. "The town doesn't know about her. I've kept her hidden because I knew what they'd say, what they'd call her, what they'd call Maria, what it would mean for her future." Marlowe stepped closer to the crib, looking down at Evangeline's perfect little face. Understanding crashed over her like a wave. This was why Cade needed a wife. Not for companionship or heirs or any normal reason. He needed legitimacy for his daughter. He needed a woman who would protect this child, love her, give her the life she deserved without the stigma that would come from being born to an unmarried woman, from having a mother who wasn't white, from being different in a world that punished difference. "She needs a mother," Cade said, his voice rough. "Someone who'll fight for her the way Maria would have. Someone who understands what it's like to be trapped by circumstances you didn't choose. I know what your father did to you, Marlowe. I know this marriage is your prison. But I'm asking you to make it mean something. I'm asking you to love my daughter." Evangeline stirred in her sleep, making a small sound, and Marlowe felt something shift in her chest. She'd been so consumed by her own suffering that she hadn't considered Cade might be suffering too. Hadn't imagined he might be just as trapped, just as desperate, just as willing to sacrifice his own happiness for someone he loved. She reached down and gently touched the child's hand, and Evangeline's tiny fingers curled around her own. In that moment, something broke and something else was born. This little girl hadn't asked to be hidden. Hadn't deserved to be kept secret like something shameful. She was innocent and perfect and deserved everything good in the world. Marlowe looked up at Cade, and he was watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I'm taking her into town. I'm introducing her as my legitimate daughter, your stepdaughter, and daring anyone to say otherwise. That's why I married you, Marlowe. That's the wedding gift that'll silence the whole town, not jewelry or property or money. The truth that this child is mine, that she's part of this family, and that anyone who has a problem with it can answer to me." Marlowe felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were something else. Something like purpose finding her when she'd given up hope. She understood now. This wasn't just about Cade saving his daughter from scandal. It was about Marlowe saving herself from meaninglessness. She'd been so focused on what was taken from her that she hadn't seen what was being offered, a chance to matter, to protect someone more vulnerable than herself, to be more than just a discarded daughter sold for debt. She knelt beside the crib, and Evangeline's eyes fluttered open, deep brown, curious, trusting. "Hello, sweet girl," Marlowe whispered. "I'm going to take such good care of you." Behind her, she heard Cade exhale like he'd been holding his breath for months. "Thank you," he said simply. And Marlowe realized that maybe, impossibly, this forced marriage might become something neither of them expected. Not love, perhaps, but something equally valuable. Partnership forged in the fire of necessity and sealed with the promise to protect an innocent child from a cruel world that would judge her for circumstances beyond her control. Morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Marlowe dressed carefully in a simple but elegant dress from her new wardrobe, her hands steadier than they'd been in months. Mrs. Hewitt helped her pin her hair up, the older woman's eyes knowing and approving. "Word's already spreading that Mr. Thornwell is coming to town with his new wife," she said softly. "Half of Copperstone will be lining the streets by the time you arrive." Marlowe's stomach fluttered with nerves, but underneath was something stronger, determination. She'd spent the night in the chair beside Evangeline's crib, watching the child sleep, making silent promises about the kind of mother she would become. When Evangeline had woken at dawn, Marlowe had fed her breakfast, changed her, played with her wooden blocks, and fallen completely in love with her bright laughter and the way she said, "Mama," even though she couldn't possibly understand what the word meant yet. Cade appeared at the nursery door dressed in his finest, A charcoal suit that made him look even more imposing, his hair combed back, his jaw freshly shaved. But his eyes were on Evangeline, and the love there transformed his entire face. He scooped her up, and she squealed with delight, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "Ready?" he asked Marlowe, and she nodded even though she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for what was coming. They took the carriage, the same one from yesterday, but this time Marlowe sat beside Cade with Evangeline between them. The child babbled happily, pointing at everything she saw through the window, completely oblivious to the storm they were riding into. Cade's jaw was set, his shoulders tense, but his hand was gentle on his daughter's head. "No matter what happens," he said to Marlowe, "we present a united front. You're her mother now in every way that matters. Let them see that." The ride into Copperstone felt both endless and too short. As they approached the town square, Marlowe saw that Mrs. Hewitt had been right. It seemed like every resident had turned out to see them. People lined the streets, crowded on porches, peered out of shop windows. The whispers started before the carriage even stopped. Marlowe could feel their eyes, their judgment, their curiosity like a physical thing pressing against her skin. Cade climbed out first, then turned to help Marlowe down while she held Evangeline. The child looked around with wide eyes at all the people, then buried her face shyly in Marlowe's shoulder. That simple gesture, the trust of it, the naturalness, steadied Marlowe more than anything else could have. She held Evangeline close and lifted her chin, meeting the stares head-on. Cade positioned himself beside them, his hands settling protectively on Marlowe's lower back, and addressed the crowd in a voice that carried across the square. "Most of you know me. Know my business. Know my reputation. Today I want you to know my family." He gestured to Evangeline, and the whispers exploded into full conversation. "This is my daughter, Evangeline Maria Thornwell. Her mother was the finest woman I ever knew, and she died giving me this gift. Some of you might want to question Evangeline's legitimacy. Question her place in my family. Question her worth." His voice dropped to something dangerous. "I suggest you don't. She is my heir. She is legally and morally mine. And Marlowe is her mother now, my wife and this child's protector. Anyone who has something to say about it can say it to my face. Right now." The silence that followed was absolute. Marlowe scanned the crowd, seeing shock, disapproval, calculation, and in some faces, particularly the women's, a grudging respect. Silas Crenshaw stood in front of his bank, his face purple with outrage, but even he didn't dare speak. Papa was there too, looking smaller somehow, his eyes fixed on Marlowe with something that might have been regret or might have been just discomfort at being associated with the scandal. Iris pushed through the crowd, her face bright with tears, and before anyone could stop her, she ran straight to Marlowe. "You look so pretty," she whispered, then looked at Evangeline with wonder. "Is this your baby?" Marlowe's heart clenched. "This is Evangeline. Your niece." The word hung in the air, claiming the relationship, making it real and undeniable. Then something unexpected happened. Old Mrs. Patterson, the general store owner who'd known Marlowe her whole life, stepped forward. She walked right up to them, ignoring Cade's intimidating presence, and looked at Evangeline with soft eyes. "She's beautiful," Mrs. Patterson said simply. Then she turned to Marlowe. "You've got yourself a family now, girl. That's more than most people get in this life." She nodded once at Cade, then walked back into her store, and that single act of acceptance broke the dam. Other women started moving forward, not all of them, but enough. They came to see Evangeline, to welcome Marlowe properly, to show that whatever judgment might exist in private would be kept there. The men followed more reluctantly, shaking Cade's hand, offering stiff congratulations, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to publicly oppose the most powerful man in the territory. Within an hour, what could have been a complete social disaster had transformed into something else. Not quite acceptance, but acknowledgement. Cade Thornwell had done the impossible. He'd claimed his daughter publicly, dared the world to reject her, and won. And Marlowe, standing there with Evangeline in her arms and her new husband beside her, realized that she'd been given something she'd never expected, not just a purpose, but power. The power to protect. The power to define what family meant. The power to rewrite the story everyone thought they knew. As they climbed back into the carriage, Evangeline sleepy against her shoulder and Cade's rare smile warming his face, Marlowe felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months. She felt hope. The weeks following the town revelation fell into an unexpected rhythm. Marlowe woke each morning to Evangeline's cheerful babbling through the wall that separated their rooms, and she'd rush to the nursery before the staff could get there, wanting every moment with the child who'd become the center of her world. They'd have breakfast together, Evangeline messily eating eggs and fruit while Marlowe told her stories about everything and nothing. The little girl was bright and curious, already speaking in small sentences, and she'd taken to calling Marlowe Mama, without any hesitation or confusion. Each time she said it, Marlowe felt her heart expand a little more, felt the bitterness of her forced marriage fade a degree further. This wasn't the life she'd chosen, but it was becoming a life she wanted. Cade remained distant but not cold. He worked from dawn until well past dark, managing the massive operation of the ranch, but he always came to the nursery before bed to kiss Evangeline goodnight. Those evening moments became Marlowe's favorite part of the day. She'd watch Cade transform, the hard businessman dissolving into a gentle father who made silly faces and read bedtime stories with dramatic voices. He'd ask Marlowe about her day with genuine interest, and slowly, carefully, they began having real conversations. Not about love or their arrangement, but about Evangeline, about ranch business, about books Marlowe was reading from his extensive library, about her sister Iris whom she missed desperately. He listened more than he talked, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. "You're good with her," he said one evening after Evangeline had fallen asleep. "Better than I dared hope. She's happy." The gratitude in his voice made Marlowe realize how frightened he must have been that she'd reject the child, that she'd make Evangeline pay for the circumstances of her birth. As spring deepened into early summer, Marlowe began taking on more responsibilities around the estate. She met with Mrs. Hewitt daily to learn household management, went over accounts, made decisions about supplies and staff schedules. She organized the gardens, started planning a proper birthday celebration for Evangeline's second birthday, and even began writing again, something she'd loved as a child but hadn't had time or resources for in years. Cade provided her with a gentle mare named Willow, and Marlowe would ride out across the property with Evangeline secured safely in front of her, showing the child the vast world that would someday be part of her inheritance. The ranch hands treated Marlowe with respect that grew into genuine affection. She learned their names, asked about their families, made sure they had what they needed. She was becoming the lady of Thornwell Estate not through force but through earning it. But not everything was peaceful. Word had reached them that there were grumblings in town, particularly from men like Silas Crenshaw who saw Cade's acceptance of Evangeline as a dangerous precedent that might encourage other improper arrangements. There was talk of legal challenges to Evangeline's inheritance rights, whispers about investigations into Maria Sanchez's background, ugly speculation about Cade's relationship with her. Marlowe could see the tension building in Cade's shoulders, could see him closing off again as he tried to protect his daughter from battles that were just beginning. One evening after Evangeline was asleep, Marlowe found him in his study, papers spread across his desk, his face haggard. "They're going to try to take her from me," he said without preamble. "Say she's not really mine, that I have no legal claim, that she should be sent to an orphanage or given to Maria's distant relatives who don't give a damn about her but would love to control a piece of this estate." Marlowe's blood ran cold. "They can't. You're her father. I'm her mother now. We're married. The law," Cade laughed bitterly. "The law is whatever rich men like Crenshaw want it to be when they're motivated enough. He's angry about losing his hold over your father's debt. He's angry that I have more influence than he does. So he'll hurt me the only way he can, through Evangeline." He looked up at Marlowe, and she saw fear there, raw and honest. "I won't let them take her. I'll burn this whole territory down before I let them take my daughter." Marlowe walked around the desk and did something she'd never done before. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Then we fight," she said firmly. "Together. They expect you to face this alone because you've always been alone. But you're not anymore. Evangeline is my daughter too. Legally, morally, in every way that matters. and I will not let anyone hurt her. Cade looked at her hand on his shoulder, then up at her face, and something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. They were partners in this, bound together by something stronger than the transaction that had brought them together, bound by their shared devotion to a child who deserved better than the world was offering her. "Thank you," Cade said quietly, and this time when he said it, Marlowe heard everything he couldn't put into words. The gratitude, yes, but also the relief of not being alone anymore, the hope that maybe they could actually win this fight, the beginning of trust that was fragile but real. That night, Marlowe lay awake in her room, listening to Evangeline's soft breathing through the wall, and made a decision. She'd been passive in her own fate for too long, sold by her father, married without choice, living a life someone else had designed. But motherhood had awakened something fierce in her. She would not be passive about Evangeline's future. If Silas Crenshaw and men like him wanted a fight, she'd give them one. She was Marlowe Thornwell now, and that name carried power she was only beginning to understand how to wield. The legal challenge came faster than expected. Within 2 weeks, papers were served claiming that Evangeline's parentage was in question and requesting a formal hearing to determine her legitimacy and Cade's rights as her father. The hearing was scheduled for mid-July at the territorial courthouse, and the whole territory seemed to hold its breath waiting for the outcome. Marlowe watched Cade prepare with the intensity of a general going to war, gathering documentation, hiring the best lawyers money could buy, compiling testimony from the midwife who'd delivered Evangeline and the priest who'd blessed Maria on her deathbed. But Marlowe knew that evidence alone wouldn't win this fight. This was about power and prejudice, and those things didn't care about truth. 3 days before the hearing, Marlowe rode into Copperstone alone. She'd told Cade she needed to visit Iris, which was partly true, but her real purpose was something else entirely. She went first to see Mrs. Patterson at the general store, then to the pastor's wife, then to the schoolteacher Miss Albright, then to every woman in town who'd shown even a hint of kindness at the wedding announcement. She sat in their parlors and drank their tea and spoke plainly. "My daughter is going to be judged by a room full of men who've decided she's not good enough because of who her mother was," Marlowe said. "They're going to try to take her from her father, from me, from the only home she's ever known. I'm asking you to come to that hearing. I'm asking you to bear witness. I'm asking you to show those men that this community is more than just their prejudice." The women listened with varying degrees of sympathy and fear. Some refused outright, couldn't risk angering their husbands, couldn't afford to be associated with scandal, couldn't stomach the social cost. But others surprised her. Mrs. Patterson agreed immediately, her jaw set with determination. "I've known Cade Thornwell since he was a boy working his father's land with nothing but sweat and stubbornness. He built an empire from dirt, and he loved Maria Sanchez with everything he had. Any fool could see that. I'll be there." Miss Albright, who'd never married and faced her own kind of judgment for being an independent woman, nodded slowly. "That child deserves a chance to grow up with her family. I'll come." One by one, Marlowe built a coalition, not of powerful men, but of women who understood what it meant to be underestimated, dismissed, or judged for circumstances beyond their control. When Marlowe returned to Thornwell Estate that evening, Cade was waiting on the front steps, his face tight with worry that softened into confusion when he saw her expression. "Where have you been?" he asked. "Building us an army," she replied, and proceeded to tell him what she'd done. For a long moment he just stared at her, and then something happened that Marlowe had never seen before. Cade Thornwell smiled. Not the small, careful expressions he gave Evangeline, but a real smile that transformed his entire face and made him look years younger. "You're remarkable," he said simply, and Marlowe felt heat rise to her cheeks. That night they sat together in his study, not on opposite sides of the desk but side by side, planning their strategy, and somewhere in those hours of whispered conversation and shared determination, the wall between them began to crumble. The day of the hearing arrived hot and oppressive, the kind of weather that made tempers short and judgment harsh. The courthouse was packed with spectators, the gallery filled with curious townspeople and ranch owners from neighboring territories who'd come to see if Cade Thornwell could be brought low. Silas Crenshaw sat in the front row, looking smug and certain. The judge was Clarence Whitmore, a man known for being fair but traditional, and Marlowe's heart sank when she saw his face. He looked like he'd already made his decision. Cade sat at the defense table with his lawyers, his face carved from stone, every inch the intimidating businessman. Marlowe sat directly behind him with Evangeline on her lap. The child was frightened by the crowd and the serious atmosphere, clinging to Marlowe and whimpering softly. Every eye in the room was on them. The prosecution's case was brutal and efficient. They questioned Evangeline's parentage despite the documentation. They painted Maria as a woman of loose morals who'd trapped Cade. They suggested Evangeline might not even be his child, that he'd been fooled by a conniving woman and was now trying to legitimize another man's bastard. They argued that even if she was his biological daughter, a child born out of wedlock had no legal right to inheritance, and that Cade's recent marriage to Marlowe was clearly a transparent attempt to circumvent proper social order. Through it all, Cade sat rigid as iron, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Marlowe could feel the rage and pain radiating off him, could see him barely holding himself together. When it was their turn, Cade's lawyers presented the evidence: birth records, testimony from the midwife and priest, documentation of Maria's character from those who'd known her, proof of Cade's consistent financial support and presence in Evangeline's life since birth. But then Marlowe stood. She hadn't planned it, hadn't discussed it with the lawyers, but she couldn't sit silent anymore. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "May I speak?" The judge looked startled. Cade turned in his seat, his eyes wide. "Mrs. Thornwell," Judge Whitmore said slowly, "this is highly irregular." "So is trying to steal a child from her father," Marlowe shot back, and a murmur ran through the crowd. The judge considered, then nodded. "You may speak." Marlowe stood with Evangeline in her arms, and the little girl wrapped her arms around Marlowe's neck, burying her face in her shoulder. "This is my daughter," Marlowe said, her voice growing stronger. "I know what you all think, that I'm just some girl who was bought, that this marriage is a sham, that I couldn't possibly love this child who isn't mine by blood. But you're wrong. I love her more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. She is mine in every way that matters. And you," she pointed at Silas Crenshaw. "You don't care about morality or legitimacy or what's best for this child. You care about power and money and putting Cade Thornwell in his place. Well, you can't have her. She belongs with us, with her family, and if you try to take her, you'll have to go through me first." The courtroom erupted. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel, calling for order. Marlowe sat down, her heart pounding, suddenly aware of how reckless she'd been. But when she looked at Cade, his eyes were shining with something that looked almost like tears, and his hand found hers and squeezed it tight. Then, one by one, the women Marlowe had visited began to stand. Mrs. Patterson first, then Miss Albright, then a dozen others, all rising in silent solidarity. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Their presence said everything. These were the mothers and daughters and sisters of Copperstone, and they were saying that Evangeline belonged with her family. Judge Whitmore looked at the standing women, at Marlowe with Evangeline clinging to her, at Cade whose mask had finally cracked to show the desperate father underneath. He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. "This court finds that Evangeline Maria Thornwell is the legitimate daughter of Cade Thornwell, with all rights and privileges thereto. Furthermore, Marlowe Thornwell is recognized as her legal mother and guardian. Case dismissed." The gavel came down like thunder, and Marlowe burst into tears, clutching Evangeline close while Cade wrapped his arms around both of them, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Marlowe felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The victory at the courthouse should have been the end of the story, but Silas Crenshaw was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. 3 nights after the hearing, fire broke out in the southern pasture of Thornwell Estate. By the time the ranch hands spotted it and raised the alarm, flames were racing across the dry summer grass, driven by wind straight toward the cattle herds and the main buildings. Marlowe woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of men shouting. She ran to Evangeline's room, scooping the terrified child from her crib, and met Cade in the hallway. His face was grim. "Get her to safety," he commanded. "Take the carriage to town. Now." But Marlowe shook her head. We fight this together, remember? I'm not running. Something fierce and proud flashed in Cade's eyes, but there was no time to argue. They evacuated the main house, Marlowe handing Evangeline to Mrs. Hewitt with strict instructions to take her and the other house staff to the chapel, the only stone building far enough from the flames to be safe. Then Marlowe did something that shocked everyone, including herself. She grabbed work clothes from the laundry, changed quickly, and joined the bucket brigade. The men stared at her like she'd lost her mind. The lady of the estate, in work pants and boots, her hair tied back, grabbing buckets and hauling water alongside ranch hands and stable boys. But Marlowe had grown up working a failing ranch. She knew how to dig fire breaks, how to beat back flames with wet blankets, how to work until her muscles screamed and her lungs burned from smoke. She worked beside men who'd been strangers months ago, and they stopped seeing her as the boss's bought wife and started seeing her as one of them. The battle against the fire lasted until dawn. Cade worked like a man possessed, directing crews, digging breaks with his own hands, pulling cattle from danger with a rope and sheer stubborn will. Marlowe saw him save 3 different men from being trapped by flames, saw him refuse water so others could drink first, saw the way his people followed him because he'd earned every ounce of their loyalty. When the last embers were finally extinguished, they'd lost a barn, maybe 50 head of cattle and several acres of pasture, but the house stood intact and no one was seriously hurt. As the sun rose over the smoke-stained valley, Marlowe stood beside Cade in the ruins, both of them covered in soot and ash, and he turned to her with something in his eyes she'd never seen before. "That fire was set," he said quietly. "I found evidence of accelerant in 3 different locations. Someone tried to destroy everything I've built." Marlowe's exhaustion vanished, replaced by cold fury. "Crenshaw." Cade nodded. "Can't prove it yet, but I know. This is his answer to losing at the courthouse. If he can't take Evangeline through law, he'll destroy us financially and hope we're too broken to fight back." He looked at Marlowe, really looked at her, taking in her soot-stained face and work-worn hands and the fierce determination in her eyes. "You should be in town right now, safe with Evangeline. Instead you're here, covered in ash, having worked all night to save my ranch." "A ranch? Why?" Marlowe met his gaze without flinching. "Because this is my home now. Because Evangeline deserves to grow up here. Because you're my husband, and whether this marriage started as a transaction or not, it's become something real. And because I'm tired of men like Crenshaw thinking they can take whatever they want from whoever they want. I was sold once. I won't be pushed around again." Something broke open between them in that moment. Cade reached out and touched her face, his thumb brushing away a streak of ash from her cheek, and the tenderness of the gesture made Marlowe's breath catch. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice rough. "When I first approached your father, I told myself it was purely practical. I needed a wife to legitimize Evangeline, and you needed escape from poverty. I chose you because you were young enough to be moldable, desperate enough to be compliant, and powerless enough that you couldn't threaten me. I thought I could keep you at arm's length, use you for my purposes, and never risk feeling anything." He paused, his hands still cupped against her face. "I was wrong about all of it. You're not moldable, you're steel wrapped in silk. You're not compliant, you're fierce in ways that humble me. And you're not powerless, you've got more strength in your little finger than most men have in their whole bodies. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being an arrangement and became something else. I don't know what to call it yet, but I know that when I thought you might be in danger tonight, I was more terrified than I've ever been in my life." Marlowe felt tears cutting tracks through the ash on her face. "I hated you at first," she admitted. "Hated being sold, hated being trapped, hated that my life was over before it began. But then I met Evangeline, and I started to see why you'd done what you did. And then I started to see you, not the cold businessman everyone else sees, but the man who reads bedtime stories in silly voices and worries himself sick over whether his daughter will be accepted and works alongside his ranch hands like their respect matters more than their fear. I don't know what this is either, Cade. But I know that when I saw those flames tonight, all I could think was that I needed to protect what we've built. Not just the ranch. The family. This." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I think I might be falling in love with you, and that terrifies me more than any fire could." Cade's response was to pull her close and kiss her, and it was nothing like the cold, perfunctory kiss they'd shared at their wedding. This was real and desperate and full of everything they'd been too afraid to say out loud. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to destroy Silas Crenshaw," he said. "Together. We're going to prove he set this fire, and we're going to make sure he never threatens our family again. But first," he smiled, that transformation that made him look like a different man entirely. "First we're going to go check on our daughter, and we're going to tell her that everything's all right. And then we're going to have the biggest, loudest, most public birthday party this territory has ever seen for her second birthday next week, and we're going to invite everyone, and we're going to show them all that the Thornwell family doesn't break. We bend, we burn, but we don't break." Marlowe laughed through her tears and kissed him again, tasting smoke and promise and the beginning of something that felt like hope transformed into certainty. They walked back toward the chapel hand in hand, both filthy and exhausted and more alive than either had felt in years. Evangeline ran to meet them, Mrs. Hewitt following behind with a smile, and the little girl threw herself into their arms crying, "Mama! Papa!" with the perfect trust of a child who knows she's safe. Cade lifted her high, making her squeal with delight despite her earlier fear, and Marlowe wrapped her arms around both of them, and in that moment she understood that family wasn't about blood or transactions or even love alone. It was about choosing each other, over and over, in the face of everything that tried to tear you apart. The sun rose higher, burning away the smoke, and Marlowe Thornwell stood in the ruins of the night's battle and felt nothing but gratitude for the beautiful, impossible, hard-won life that had become hers. Evangeline's second birthday party was held exactly 1 week after the fire, and it was the social event of the season. Marlowe had thrown herself into planning it with the intensity of a general preparing for battle. This wasn't just about celebrating a child, though she loved Evangeline with an intensity that still sometimes surprised her. This was about making a statement. The Thornwells were here to stay. They would not be intimidated. They would not hide. And anyone who had a problem with Evangeline's heritage or their family's unconventional beginning could choke on their judgment. The estate was transformed with decorations, streamers and lanterns and tables laden with enough food to feed the entire territory. Marlowe had personally invited every family in Copperstone and the surrounding ranches, making it clear that attendance was expected and refusal would be remembered. The day arrived perfect and clear, hot but with a breeze that kept things bearable. People came in droves, some out of genuine affection, others out of curiosity or the knowledge that snubbing Cade Thornwell was social and economic suicide. The children ran wild in the gardens, playing games Marlowe had organized. The adults congregated in clusters, drinking lemonade and stronger things, talking in low voices about the fire that everyone knew was arson even if no one could prove it yet. Cade moved through the crowd like a king among his subjects, Evangeline on his shoulders, her tiny hands tangled in his hair, her laughter ringing across the estate. Every time someone congratulated him on his daughter, he'd gesture to Marlowe and say, "Thank my wife, she's the one who makes this family work." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and it made Marlowe's heart swell every time. Iris found Marlowe by the dessert table, and the sisters embraced with tears streaming down both their faces. "I've missed you so much," Iris whispered. "I'm so proud of you. Mama would be proud too." That blessing, spoken in the voice of the sister who knew her best, meant more to Marlowe than any acceptance from the town ever could. They spent an hour catching up, Iris telling her about school and friends and how Papa had been sober for 3 weeks now and seemed smaller somehow, diminished by shame. Marlowe felt a complicated tangle of emotions about that, but mostly she felt free. Free of the obligation to fix him, to save him, to set herself on fire to keep him warm. She'd built something new instead, something that fed her soul rather than draining it. Then came the moment Marlowe had been planning for weeks. She'd worked with Cade to prepare a surprise, and as the afternoon shadows lengthened, she stood on the veranda and called for everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, turning to look at her. Marlowe felt the weight of their gazes but didn't flinch. She'd learned that power wasn't just about money or land, it was about knowing your worth and refusing to apologize for taking up space. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate Evangeline," she began, her voice carrying across the garden. When I married Cade 3 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd been sold and trapped and that I'd spend the rest of my days pretending to be happy in a prison made of silk. She saw people shift uncomfortably, saw her father's face flush with shame. But I was wrong. I was given something I never expected, a family, a purpose, a daughter who I love more than breathing, and a husband who gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Not jewelry, not money, but trust. He trusted me with the thing he loved most in the world. And in doing so, he gave me back myself. Cade stood at the edge of the crowd, Evangeline in his arms, and the look on his face made Marlowe's voice catch. But she pushed on. The gift that silenced this town wasn't the wedding itself. It was what Cade did the day after, bringing Evangeline into the light, claiming her publicly, daring all of you to reject the daughter he loved. That took more courage than anything I've ever witnessed. But there's another gift I want to give today. She gestured, and Mrs. Hewitt appeared with a large canvas covered by a cloth. Marlowe pulled the cloth away, revealing a portrait unlike any Copperstone had ever seen. It showed the three of them, Cade, Marlowe, and Evangeline, painted in vivid colors with incredible skill. But in the background, rendered in softer tones like a guardian angel, was Maria Sanchez. The artist had worked from descriptions and a small photograph Cade had kept hidden, and she'd captured Maria's beauty and strength perfectly. The crowd gasped. Some looked scandalized. Others looked moved to tears. Marlowe let them react, then continued. This portrait will hang in the entrance hall of this house for all time. Because Evangeline deserves to know the woman who gave her life. Because Maria deserves to be remembered with honor, not shame. Because love doesn't follow society's rules, and sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones built from broken pieces. She looked directly at Silas Crenshaw, who stood rigid with outrage. Some of you will hate this. Some of you will think we're flouting decency. And honestly, I don't care. This is our family. This is our truth. And we're done apologizing for it. She turned back to Cade, her voice softening. Happy birthday to our daughter. May she grow up knowing that she's loved beyond measure, that she comes from strength on all sides, and that she'll never, ever be ashamed of who she is. The silence that followed was absolute, breathless. Then, incredibly, applause started. It began with Mrs. Patterson, her weathered hands clapping firmly. Miss Albright joined in. Then other women, and then their husbands, until most of the crowd was applauding, and the sound of it rolled across the estate like thunder. Not everyone clapped. Crenshaw stormed off with his supporters, and some of the older, more conservative families left shortly after. But more stayed than left, and their staying meant something. It meant Copperstone was changing. It meant that sometimes courage was contagious. It meant that love, when defended fiercely enough, could reshape the world around it. Cade walked up to the veranda, handed Evangeline to Mrs. Hewitt, and pulled Marlowe into his arms right there in front of everyone. He kissed her deeply, unashamedly, and when they broke apart, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm the luckiest man alive. And any of you who still doubt that can answer to me." The party continued long into the evening, but Marlowe barely remembered the rest of it. She was too happy, too overwhelmed, too aware that somehow, impossibly, the worst thing that had ever happened to her had transformed into the best. Later, after the guests had left and Evangeline was asleep in her crib, Marlowe and Cade stood on the balcony of her room, their room now, as he'd moved his things in that morning without asking, and she'd said nothing because she wanted him there. They looked out over the estate, over the valley that rolled away into darkness, at stars so thick they looked like scattered diamonds. "I found proof," Cade said quietly, "about the fire. Crenshaw paid 2 of my former ranch hands to set it. I'm taking the evidence to the marshal tomorrow. He'll hang for this." Marlowe nodded, feeling a fierce satisfaction. Justice was coming. But more than that, she felt peace. Whatever battles lay ahead, they'd face them together. "I want to adopt her," she said suddenly. "Evangeline. I want it to be legal, official, irrevocable. I want her to be mine in every way." Cade turned to her, his eyes shining in the moonlight. "She already is. Has been since the moment she called you Mama and you answered. He pulled Marlowe close, his arms solid and warm around her. I love you, Marlowe Thornwell. I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe when you stood up in that courtroom, maybe when you fought the fire beside me, maybe the first time I saw you hold my daughter. But I love you completely, messily, permanently. This marriage might have started as a transaction, but it's become the realest thing in my life. You're the realest thing in my life. Marlowe kissed him, tasting salt from the tears sliding down her cheeks, happy tears this time, healing tears. I love you too. I love this life we're building. I love that little girl sleeping in the next room. I love that we're partners and parents and something I don't even have words for yet. When Papa sold me, I thought it was the end of everything. But it was just the beginning. She looked up at the stars, at the vast Montana sky that held countless possibilities. Thank you for giving me a family. For giving me purpose. For seeing me when I felt invisible. For trusting me with what matters most. That's the real gift that silenced the town, not scandal or wealth or defiance. Love. The kind of love that transforms everything it touches. They stood there together as the night deepened, two people who'd started as strangers in a forced arrangement and become something infinitely more precious. Partners in every sense, parents to a child who would grow up knowing she was cherished, survivors of fire and judgment and their own wounded pasts. Inside, Evangeline slept peacefully, dreaming whatever innocent dreams two-year-olds dream, completely unaware of the battles fought on her behalf or the love that surrounded her like armor. And in the morning, they'd wake up and do it all again. The hard work of running the ranch, of raising a child, of building a marriage that honored both Maria's memory and their own growing love, of proving that family could be whatever you decided to make it. The town would talk, of course. They always did. But the Thornwells had learned that silence wasn't about stopping gossip. It was about making your truth so undeniable that words became inadequate, that judgment dissolved in the face of genuine love and fierce devotion. They'd silence Copperstone not by forcing acceptance but by living so authentically that eventually, resistance became exhausting. Some would never accept them. But enough would. And that would be enough. Marlowe Thornwell stood on her balcony in the home she'd inherited through pain and transformed through love, and she smiled at the future stretching out before them, uncertain, challenging, but undeniably, gloriously theirs.